Hello, my name is Ibrahim Majid, Section 14, student number 061, presentation number 3. I will talk about football war, a war that happened between two countries because of football. These two countries are El Salvador and Honduras, and one thing these two countries have in common is being fanatic about football. But do they love it so much that they will go to war for it? You bet they will, and that is no good. First, I will talk about the political situation, about the World Cup and the war. First, the political situation. If you look at the land size of these two countries, Honduras is much larger than El Salvador. However, El Salvador have a larger population than Honduras, which is made up of mostly farmers, and there wasn't enough lands for them to live and work. So they started moving to Honduras in search of land. And by the 1960s, a huge number of illegal immigrants had crossed over the border from El Salvador. Meanwhile, in Honduras, it's 1963, and there is a man that staged a military coup to prevent the rise of communism and is now the military leader of the country. He immediately began harassing the peasants' union, and he was a little insecure about the legitimacy of his leadership, so he holds an election and wins. But then the opposing party said, hey, that election was clearly corrupt, and you have been bribed by the rich American companies who are taking all of our banana tax-free and ruining our economy. So everyone started to get mad at him, and now if you ever find yourself the barely legitimate military leader of a corrupt Central American country and you start getting into hot water, here is a bit of advice that has been tested and tried throughout centuries. Blame something else. So he blamed the Salvadorian immigrants for stealing all the land and all the jobs and ruining Honduras. The immigrants found themselves under attack by the hostile locals. The Honduran government began evicting Salvadorian immigrants who have been living on the land for generations, and started sending them back to El Salvador. The El Salvadorian elites were furious and protested, citing moral reasons, but in reality they were just getting a little too crowded. So tensions were about as high as they could be, but then the World Cup came. It's the 1970 World Cup qualifiers, and both countries finished top of their qualifications. So it's now time for them to play against each other in a series of matches. The first match took place in Honduras. The night before the game, Hondurians gathered outside the Salvadorian team's hotel, making noises and taunting them. The next day, Hondurans defeated the exhausted Salvadorians with a late 90th minute goal. Emotions were running high as the next match took place in El Salvador, and this time the tables were turned. And the Hondurians had to endure a sleepless night in their hotel. And the next day, before the match started, instead of the Honduran flag, the Salvadorians raised their T-rag. They did a great job at reducing tensions, honestly. Uh, El Salvador won decisively over the exhausted Hondurians, while spectators battled in the stands. The Hondurians team fled back home in a bulletproof bus with the rocks being thrown at them. In response to the defeat, Hondurians began terrorizing the Salvadorian settlers even more. In some cases, they were throwing them off the land and burning down their homes, and the immigrants began fleeing back to El Salvador. Last but not least, the war. The final game in Mexico would decide who will go to the World Cup. It was close, but El Salvador came out victorious, knocking Honduras out of the tournament. The atmosphere was riotous, literally, and back in Honduras, attacks on the Salvador immigrants further increased in intensity, and this was too much for the El Salvador government to bear. With its people under attack, and an unmanageable refugee crisis on its hand, El Salvador severed all diplomatic ties with Honduras and declared war. The football war is also known as the Hundred Hours War, because that's how long it lasted, making it one of the shortest wars in history. So now I'll talk about the war. El Salvador started carrying out air raids in strategic locations, like international airports, which crippled the air force of Honduras. Their advances was rapid. They were quickly approaching the Honduran capital, and then the Organization of American States, which is OAS, met in a bit of panic and agreed that war between El Salvador and Honduras was a bad thing and probably shouldn't continue. So they went to El Salvador and said, "Can you stop invading Honduras?" And El Salvador declared not until they stopped harassing out their people, and so on, and so the war went on. The situation was no longer advantageous to El Salvador. So when the OAS once again asked them to stop and agreed to ensure the safety of the Salvadorian immigrants, El Salvador relented and a ceasefire was organized. Then the OAS said, "Can you now withdraw your troops from Honduras?" And they said no, and they've been negotiating for days until the OAS said to the El Salvador, "Hey, do as we say or we will sanction you." So El Salvador pulled out its troops out of Honduras, and with casualties in the thousands, the war was over. In conclusion, I talked about the political situation, about the World Cup, and about the war. Uh, the economies of both countries were damaged by the war, and El Salvador didn't have the capability to take care of all the returning refugees, and a crisis that eventually led to a civil war, and the war left behind many land, and border disputes, some of which are still a cause of tension to this day. El Salvador went to play on the World Cup but lost every match they played. So in the end, nobody achieved anything and there were no winners. Thank you.